This educational video is a public service by the Ohio Department of Higher Education, the Ohio Cyber Range Institute, and the University of Dayton Center for Cybersecurity and Data Intelligence. Learn more about this and other cybersecurity topics at the Ohio Cyber Range Institute and the University of Dayton Center for Cybersecurity and Data Intelligence.
Hi, my name is James Robinson. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication, and I also work in the Center for Cybersecurity and Data Intelligence. Today I want to talk about ransomware, but before we can talk about ransomware, I need to talk about malware, because ransomware is just one type of malware. Malware is any malicious software. In other words, it's a piece of software that's designed by somebody to damage the computer or the privacy rights of the ultimate end user. There are a lot of different types of malware, ransomware being just one of them. One type of malware that you commonly see is called a virus, and we also talk about worms. And viruses and worms are largely, the terms are used largely interchangeably, but suffice to say, unless you want to get into the technical details, a virus and a worm, what they're going to do is they're going to replicate and they're going to cause havoc on a computer. The types of havoc that they cause can range from simply reproducing itself to actually deleting files or damaging the content of a file by rewriting or writing over a file. There's a third kind of malware that you'll hear about. Is called a Trojan horse. And a Trojan horse is just basically a piece of software, a piece of malware that allows a computer hacker to come back in through the system in a way that the end user and that the designers of the operating system didn't intend. So it's just like having a key to get back into the computer, except they come in through the software. And so a Trojan horse is a particularly dangerous type of malware because it allows somebody to gain control over your computer. Spyware is another kind of malware that we see pretty commonly. If you hear about spyware attacks in the media, you'll typically hear about somebody being able to turn on the camera or turn on the microphone of somebody else's computer, and then they can monitor whatever that person is doing. But you'll also hear about key logging software. And in the case of key logging software, what happens is that the software actually records all of the keystrokes, puts them in a file, and then sends those keystrokes off to the hacker. And then that way the hacker can look and see whatever's been typed on the computer, and in that way they can also gain access to their online accounts, because when they log into those accounts, their username and password are recorded. The more sophisticated spyware also takes images off of the screen so that they can so that the hacker has the advantage of being able to see what the poor end user, the victim, and what they're typing in, what's on the screen at that time. So they can see, oh, they're the Amazon, they're logging into their Amazon account, they're typing in password and username. There's a pretty good chance that this is their Amazon account. Adware, you don't hear about it like you used to, but adware is basically a kind of software that once it gets downloaded on a person's computer, what happens is that advertising pops up on their computer. While this may not, seem like a big deal, the adware can become pretty aggressive, and it'll start popping up. It'll pop up one little window selling some product, and then it'll start 2, 3, 4, 5, 57, and pretty soon you won't even be able to use the computer anymore, or at least in some cases, because so many ads are popping up all the time. Scareware is a variation of, I think of it as being a variation of adware, but in the case of scareware, what happens is that the end user is notified by a pop-up on their screen that they have some kind of problem with their system. It might say that they have a virus, or it might say that they have a worm or something like that, and then it says, if you want to get rid of this problem on your computer, click here, and there's a link, and then it takes you out, and then it'll supposedly take you to a website. You enter in your credit card information, and then they'll download a piece of software, antivirus software, something along those lines, and anti-malware software, and then that is supposed to jump onto your computer, install itself, and then remove whatever viruses you have. The deal with scareware is that there usually is no virus, or there usually is no problem with the computer beyond the scareware. So it just says, oh, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem. And people then, of course, download their credit card information or whatever so that they can get rid of the problem. And of course, now the hacker has your credit card information. But the kind of malware that I want to talk about today is called ransomware. And you've probably heard a little bit about ransomware. It's been in the media lately. It's kind of the number one hit with a bullet, if you will. It's one of the biggest problems in cybersecurity at the moment. And in a ransomware attack, what happens is that the ransomware malware gets installed on a system. And once it gets installed on a system, it executes and goes in the background, and it takes all of the files on the system and it actually encrypts them or makes them unreadable. And so that's a particularly nefarious kind of a problem to have. All of your files are still on your system, but the problem is that you can no longer access them because they're encrypted. So obviously with a name like ransomware, the solution that's available to the end user is to pay the ransom, and then their files will be restored. So ransomware is distributed in a bunch of different ways. The most common ways we see are email. They'll come in as links sending you someplace, or USB drives. You find a USB drive that has malware installed on it, or phony websites. We call that drive-by attacks. And so some hacker will gain access to a legitimate website, or they'll create a phony website and direct somebody there. And if they go to that website, then the ransomware gets installed on their system. Okay, so we can see here that there's a lot of these. I put on some of the more famous ones here. These are the names of some of the ransomware software that you might see if you were looking in the newspaper, say, for example. But there's hundreds more and variations on all these things, on all these types. The malware, again, it uses encryption to alter the files on a computer, just like you would if you were trying to encrypt your files to keep them from being seen or to be able to be seen from by prying eyes. So you can protect your files on your computer by encrypting them, which means that they're no longer readable without a key. But the cyber criminal use of encryption is to take those files and to turn them into something that's no longer accessible to the end user. The encryption nowadays is complex. So if the encryption is complex, it's almost something we don't even need to say. It is going to be complex. And the truth of the matter is that it's so complex that the NSA won't be able to restore your files. There's no chance, if your files become encrypted, that you're going to figure out a way to get your files back without paying the ransom. So this is an example of a Microsoft Word document. You know, you've seen a million of them. There it is. That's what a Word document looks like. So now we're going to see this is what that same file looks like after it's been encrypted, and you can see that it's total gibberish, and you can see that there's no way that you could discern even what this file, you know, what information was ever contained in this file. So effectively the information is gone. And so when your system gets attacked by a ransomware attack, what happens is after all the files on your system are encrypted, then you get this little pop-up window. And the pop-up window says, hey, you can't get to your files anymore. In this case, it tells you that the name of the ransomware attack is Tesla Crypt. It gives you this little window here, tells you how you can, up top it tells you what you need to do to get your files back. Right down here it gives you an opportunity to show you that we can in fact decrypt these files since they've already been encrypted, so we can prove to you that we can restore your files. So when you see this pop up or whatever it is, it says, hey, your files are gone, and what you need to do is you need to pay a ransomware. In the good old days, a ransom might be a couple of $100. It might only be $100. Nowadays, of course, ransomware is the fees that you have to pay, the ransom you have to pay is much, much, much higher. But in the old days, you could do it for a relatively reasonable, if there is such a thing, amount of money. And that ransom is always paid by either Bitcoin Or in the smaller cases, in the smaller scale cyber criminals, they would actually use gift cards. And so then if you make your payment, then you're sent the decryption key, and then you can go in there and actually decrypt your files and live happily ever after. At least that's the word. And in this case, the test, if you will, to demonstrate that this actually works would be if you were to put one of the file names in this little window here and click on it or whatever it is, it will actually decrypt the file. So you can see, okay, these guys encrypted my files and they can decrypt my files. Now I have some reason to believe them. It's sort of like proof of life in a kidnapping, if you will. And so then you pay your Bitcoin, or you send in your gift cards to them, the numbers on your gift cards, and then lo and behold, your files are restored. At least that's the intent or the way that this is supposed to work. What are some of the unintended consequences of a ransomware attack? 2020, a health service with 400 facilities was victimized in a ransomware attack. The University of Health has hospitals and healthcare facilities all over Europe and the United States. It was the Ryuk, I hope that's how you say it, ransomware software, and it forced the hospitals that had their files encrypted, it forced them to send their emergency room patients to other hospitals because they could no longer treat those patients effectively. And so earlier in that same month in Dusseldorf, Germany, there was an attack, and they had to route a patient, a woman, who was arriving in an ambulance. They had to reroute her to another hospital because their system was infected with this ransomware. And so what happened there, that as they took this patient, it was only like 20 kilometers or so, so it wasn't like they had to take them to the other side of the earth, but the patient died on the way to the hospital because they had to be sent to the other hospital. And, who's to say if the patient would have lived, if they would have been able to go to the hospital in Dusseldorf? Nobody knows that for sure. But suffice to say, this is credited or alleged to be the first time that there was actually a death attributable to a ransomware attack. Okay? I can assure you that it will not be the last death caused by a ransomware attack. Other unintended consequences: medical records become inaccessible or permanently lost. Surgical procedures have to be canceled. Medical tests were postponed and hospital admissions had to be halted. 911 emergency services can become interrupted. Dispatch centers have to use printed maps and paper logs to keep track of emergency responder locations. So if somebody calls 911, they have to be routed using maps and directions over the radio. Police police would be unable to access criminal histories and active warrants. We've had two fairly recent instances of that in the greater Dayton area. And in fact, it's becoming more and more common because hospitals and police facilities and universities and schools, there's a lot of potential for damage, or there's a lot of reason that people want to get that they want to pay these ransom because of the possible outcomes of such an attack. So surveillance systems go offline. We said the schools. Yeah, we said that. Ukrainian power grid was taken down by the Russians. U.S. gas, oil, and natural gas distributions were affected. You remember the Colonial Pipeline attack. And then in Australia, an electricity provider was victimized, but they still managed to generate enough electricity to run their country. So that was a good thing. In the U.S., fairly recently, 3 U.S. water treatment plants were impacted by ransomware. So you see that there's a big problem with ransomware. And of course, the question becomes, if you as an individual become victim of an attack, a ransomware attack, should you pay? And the answer to this question is very simple. How valuable are the files that you've lost? If they're valuable enough to you and you have no backup available to you to gain access to those files in some other way, you have to pay to get them back. That's it in a nutshell. It's often cheaper. Organizations, large businesses, even with incredibly complicated and sophisticated backup mechanisms in place, even those organizations find that it's often cheaper to pay the ransom than it is to restore their network from their own backup drive. It takes less time, takes less effort. Most victims get most of their files back if they pay. That's true of large organizations, and it's true of small individuals as well. But it's certainly no guarantee. There are people that don't get any files back, obviously, if the decryption process doesn't work. These days, organizations actually hope that they get attacked by professional cyber criminals and not amateurs. And they hope that because the amateurs will just keep attacking again and again and again, whereas the professionals will not do that, generally speaking. They will allow you to restore your files, and they will leave you alone. There's not necessarily a finite amount of time where you're relatively safe from attack, but they do not generally attack again and again and again, because this is part of their business plan. They know that if they capture your files and then you pay the ransom and they restore it, that then their business model will work again and again and again. The other problem with amateurs is that the percentage of files that are ultimately recovered are lower with amateur attacks than they are with professional attacks, and more of the files are corrupted and or no good after they've been decrypted. One of the most interesting things I have found in looking at information about ransomware is this: cyber criminals actually provide very sophisticated and high quality technical support to their victims. So when that little pop-up comes up and says, your files have been encrypted, and they say, here's how you have to pay this is the amount of your ransom, this is how you have to pay your ransom, you can actually call a 1-800 number, or you can use email, and you can actually contact a technical support person that'll tell you how you can obtain Bitcoin, because who knows how to obtain Bitcoins. They'll tell you how to decrypt your files after you've paid your ransom, and they'll actually walk you through the ransom, the decryption process. So that if a lot of us wouldn't have any idea where to get a Bitcoin, and a lot of us would have no idea how to run a decryption program. So they'll actually walk you through that to make sure that your files are restored. So I guess the bottom line here is that ransomware is a big problem, and it's a problem that's here to stay. And it's becoming more and more and more sophisticated over time. So thank you for listening.